I have to say that I know very little about the next session, the session besides the next title, which is what we need to make everybody connected. I know very little because she brings it all. So it's secret for all of us. But I do know two important things. The first, I remember from studying it and even teaching it at class to students that Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, stated that after many, many years running with what we call the Web 2.0, he said, this is not Web 2.0. We're calling it 2.0, but we should say 0.2, because it starts to be a bit what I design it. And the second thing, the person who will elaborate on this is Sonia Jorge, and she has more than 25 years of diverse international experience in both private and non-profit sectors. She has worked on numerous digital policy and development projects for over 40 countries with international organizations such as the World Bank, UN Women, and other private sector companies. She's also executive director at the Alliance for Affordable Internet at the World Wide Web Foundation. Sonia, welcome in. Thank you.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Okay.
I have to say that I will be paying attention carefully to ask you.
Be.
I will be, and I'll bring a couple of questions after I listen what you have to explain to us, and
Great.
I will invite one or two of you, I don't know, depending on the time, to also ask something to Sonia. I would love to do that. So just start thinking on a question, and the ones who are connected through internet, on Twitter, whatever, and they want to just, I don't know, there is some question or a thought, I will try to catch it also. Sonia, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, most importantly, to the organizers for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things, some of which actually go to some of the points that Nuria was just making, but really thinking about not just what we need to do to get everyone connected, but what is it that we need to know first to even start conceiving what is it that we need to do. And let me tell you two things before I go into my presentation. One is, first of all, and there were some people talking about it earlier today around data, we absolutely need to understand the consequences of what we don't know. And the truth is, while we're learning a lot of it we don't know. We also don't know at all about how people are using or are conceiving their uses of the internet, because more than half of the world is disconnected, right? But the other thing I also wanted to note first, before I go into more details, and especially because you're focusing here on the urban contribution, right? And on cities this week here in Barcelona. And I wanted to make a point that cities do not exist in a vacuum. And cities themselves will have greater challenges if they don't consider themselves in a continuum that also includes rural areas, that include remote areas in any country. So while it's important for us to think about cities and city governments and policies that are specific to urban problems, they actually are linked to rurality. So with that in mind, let me start by making a couple of points to you that I know some of you know, but I want to help you think differently. First, we know that half of the world's population is offline. And what these causes is major inequality, major exclusion around the world, and especially in what we call the Global South. Countries that we at the Alliance for Affordable Internet that I work with, we care the most. These are countries that are low and middle income countries around the world, where really the majority of the unconnected are, but also where people that are supposedly connected actually are underserved. And some speakers also mentioned this problem earlier. But how much do countries lose for failing to close not just a digital gender gap, but all of these different dimensions of the digital divide that exists in the world today? So I want to start by sharing with you a couple of things from a recent report that we just published. It's called The Cost of Exclusion, the Economic Consequences of the Gender Divide. And I am specifically focusing on gender because regardless of how you look, women fare the worst. Regardless of where you are, regardless of which part of the world, if it's rural or urban, women and girls fare worse, okay? So women are less likely to be connected. In less developed countries, the gender gap is tremendous, about 52%. Take a look at our report for a lot of really good details. But not only that, we've known this for far too long. Each and every one of us here in this room, if you tell me that you didn't know about it, I would be surprised. But what I want to ask you and challenge you today is that what have you done about it? Have you done anything to change that picture? And if you didn't, this is your time to do something. We know exactly what to do. We know exactly how to do. And what we need is goodwill and real will to change the world, okay? Now, a couple of stark points. The world has lost. In just looking at low and middle income countries, we as a world have lost an opportunity of $1 trillion in GDP just in low and middle income countries for not having included women and girls in digital economies. Okay? A society is made up of everyone that belongs to it. And when we exclude, when we directly, indirectly are feeding inequalities, we are all, including all of you here in this room, part of the equation of exclusion and inequality. So we as a world have failed to not only benefit all of us together, but also benefited from the knowledge that we could have had if all of those people, especially women and girls, were part of our digital ecosystem. So think about $1 trillion. 1 year alone in 2020, we lost $126 billion for not having included women in the digital society. And if we do something about it, again, we actually do know what we can do. We will have an increase of $524 billion in economic activity from now until 2024 if the gender gap is closed. Now, I mentioned earlier, we are making very slow progress. In fact, knowing these have not made us do enough. The gender gap has only changed 0.5 percentage point. That is unacceptable. If we think that's okay, we're doing a disservice to ourselves, to our communities, being urban communities, rural communities, to the world, and to the women and girls of the world. Now, there's a couple of things that we can do. One of them is that we actually know how much it will take to bring people online. We know the right policies that actually support bringing more people online. We know how to develop and design gender-responsive policies, okay? But we're not doing it. Now, let me start with the numbers, and then we'll talk about some of the details. The investments that are required, and I want to mention these, they may seem like a lot, $428 billion you saw in the previous slide. But let me just start with one kind of contrast. The $428 billion that we need to connect the world by 2030, and these are resources that need to be invested in infrastructure to make sure that people have a certain level of quality of connectivity, okay? And they have the skills, and then there is a policy framework that is supportive of this infrastructure development. $428 billion to bring the world online by 2030. That is exactly the same as we as a world spend annually in 1 year on soda, carbonated drinks. Give that a thought, okay? But we have a hard time thinking about that investment for connecting humanity. Infrastructure is a big part of that equation, and it's a very important one. Because the truth is, if people are not connected, all the wonderful things, all the opportunities, the rights, the education, health, knowledge, everything, the compilation of benefits from digital opportunity are completely irrelevant, right? But we do need to start with infrastructure, no matter what. And so we do a lot of work focusing on not just incentivizing investments, but making sure that the investments are the right investments. We're not talking about investing in infrastructure that is going to go underutilized. We need to talk about investment at the same time as we make sure that people are afforded skills and are really able to become digital citizens, okay? So while infrastructure is absolutely important, especially as you can see here, not only is there, but often when infrastructure is there, is underutilized. So people are supposedly covered by mobile networks in this case, but often what happens is that they cannot use. They cannot afford, that's the first barrier, and then they cannot use for different reasons. One of which is devices, also skills, content, language, many other aspects of the entire access equation, right? What we like to call at the Alliance for Affordable Internet, meaningful access. And what is meaningful access? Meaningful access is the concept that you think about connectivity and you think about affordability, you think about something that we call meaningful connectivity that I'll tell you more about, and the social environment elements that allow us to really benefit and utilize technology in a way that is beneficial for our own lives, individually, collectively, as communities, etc. Now, affordable and meaningful connectivity, let's start with those two elements. The UN has established, based on our research that we're very proud of, the affordability target for the world, okay? And that is that entry-level, 1 gigabyte of entry-level internet connection should never be more than 2% of monthly average incomes, okay? And people measure not just affordability, but also access to the internet in ways that have been quite questionable, okay? So we at the Alliance have developed a concept of meaningful connectivity, which extends and expands the idea that access to the internet is not just about affordability, though that is a very important starting point, but we have to have the quality of connections that really allow people to utilize for a purpose, okay? And quality of connections means that, we need to think about making sure that people that have access actually have access frequently, whenever they want. Right now, the world measures internet access by simply saying that if someone accessed the internet once in the last 3 months, they count as a user. So if you think about the half of the world that supposedly is connected and the half of the world that is not connected, in fact, the half of the world that supposedly is connected, many folks are not connected to quality connections that are affordable and that they can afford to have it on a daily basis, or a weekly basis, or a monthly basis. They count as users if they only have access to the internet once in 3 months. Second, access to the internet can never be simply a binary. As you know, it's a lot more complex, but also interesting, right? Our experiences are multiple. And so access to the internet has to be a reflection of those experiences as well. It's not just about off and online. It's beyond that. It's how you experience when you are online, okay? And of course, I mentioned to you that there's a lot of infrastructure that goes underutilized. It's this idea, this illusion that there is coverage when in fact people cannot access. In some countries of the world, I can tell you, not to make anyone stand out, but in some countries, you have as much as 70% of fiber infrastructure completely underutilized and not even being used. And that's a problem. So this concept of digital connectivity is a way to bring clarity to what we want internet connectivity to mean, to look like, not just to be affordable, but to be affordable, have the quality, and provide the experience that we require. And I think the pandemic has made it very clear to all of us around the world that if you don't have the experience, you actually excluded. It's not just about the inequality in the experience, but for the most part, many people were actually excluded from the opportunity because either they didn't have enough speed, enough data, right? Or they weren't able to access the internet and use it on a daily basis, but also they didn't have the right devices. All of those dimensions, what we call the dimensions of meaningful connectivity, are critical. And all of them together provide the foundation, technical and to a certain extent economic and social, that allow for what we call then meaningful access. On top of that, you have skills, content, policy, frameworks, etc., that then facilitate what then people want to have, which is meaningful use. That they define by themselves how they want to use and when, etc. Now, these investments are still necessary for several reasons. One of the things that we do in the Alliance for Affordable Internet is that we work with governments around the world, especially in low and middle income countries, to help them have the right policy and regulatory frameworks that not only will incentivize the investments that are required by private sector, but also that governments are ready to fill in the gaps and to actually become more active partners, similarly to what speakers mentioned earlier today in a couple of panels, that governments become active partners in the digital inclusion journey. Okay? And that means that, yes, you start with competition and markets working, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you create space and you make new innovations in policy and investments happen in partnership with governments and private sector, with governments and civil society, and other kinds of opportunities. Here in Spain, you have, and in Europe, you have some examples of rural cooperatives, community networks, all sorts of different complementary and alternative providers that are absolutely critical. Yet, in many countries of the world, those options are forbidden. You cannot have those opportunities in a market because markets actually prevent small and medium-sized operators or small and medium-sized companies to provide internet access because of all sorts of other restrictions in the licensing framework and other elements. We cannot have that. We have to change the political and policy frameworks to not only embrace innovation, not just in policy, but also in service provision. We don't have to have internet services being provided simply by the large mobile operators, right? We can have internet service being provided by smaller operators, medium-sized, cooperatives, community networks, Wi-Fi organizations, different kinds of ISPs around the world, and also, in many cases, by government. Because in fact, for the poorest of the poorest in the world, government will always be the last resort, okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what a public good is. That's what public service is. And good public policy is developed in the public interest. And the public interest is to make sure that the public, all the public, women and girls, men and boys, rural populations, populations of different backgrounds, of different races, of different orientations, have access that they have a right to have, and that nothing prevents them from having that. So everything that prevents that experience, we need to fight for, and we need to change. There are many things that can be done. Many things that we are working as the Alliance for Affordable Internet at the Web Foundation in many different parts of the world to make sure that these concepts of meaningful connectivity, affordability, and overall meaningful access become enshrined in the thinking that drives digital policy. The thinking that is used to design broadband plans, licensing frameworks, universal access policy, the collaboration between the digital development space and education and health and agriculture and finances. We are all interconnected. And we can only get to a point where in 2030 the world is connected if we are to do that together, if we have the will, the political will and the responsibility to make it happen. If we don't do that, right now our analysis shows that we are about 20 years behind our targets for the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of internet access. And what I can tell you is that I don't want to be part of that. But by default, it appears that we are, and each and every one of you here in this room are. So what I ask you is, please react. Do not sit tight and enjoy a show. There is no show. The show is one that we all have a role. So make your role, find your calling, your cause, and react. Rights, education, access, okay? Connectivity and targets. React and don't sit. Just get up and do something. thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I reacted. You said, don't sit, and I stand up. Some things, for example, Manuel Portela, someone who's following you, I suppose from home, he says, he got like your first sentence. We need to understand the consequences of what we do not know. I think that was a really good starting point. While we have, I don't know if someone there wants to make any question upstairs or down here. I hope to see some hands up. I wanted to ask you just about what you end up explaining. You were saying more or less a bit more than, let's say, 40% still disconnected in the world. And while you were explaining, I thought, should this not be a public service? I mean, we've learned so much about what governments or political wills are. When we talk about big infrastructures, we can see that huge things can happen. But we've been many years with the internet, and it looks like this should be a public service because it could help a lot of people. So why is it so hard for the administration?
I wish I had the answer to that question. If I did, I think I would be in a different place right now. But what I'll tell you is, I think everyone understands, especially post-pandemic, it's one of the side effects of COVID, right? People have really started rethinking the importance of digital access and digital technology in our society, not just as simply a way to get access to an internet and going on a browser, but actually the different things that technology supports in our lives. And I think, through health services, education, the fact that kids all over the world were forced to go online, but then many kids are still offline and off school, really emphasized to people the fact that, well, it doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't work that way for everybody. So it is important to think about it being not just a public good, a public service. Absolutely, I agree with you, but it's a political question as well. I would like to be at a point where we can all not just accept, but work for internet access to be a human right. But when you say something like that, and I'm sure you all in this room, or many of you understand the political consequences of that, there's a lot of friction and tension because that puts access to the internet at the same level as access to water, sanitation, shelter, education. And I think there's still a little bit of misunderstanding as to how those are equally important. Is it an equalizer of social development or not? I would argue, because this is what we do, and I think it's important that we continue that argument. But I think for now, what's happening is that we see access and digital technology as, I would say, a tool for all of the levels of development that have to take place in a society. And as long as we see that as also a public good and a right, even if it's not enshrined as a human right, that's okay. We can live with that. Policy changes take a long time. So what I would say is that it's not there yet. Should it be? Yes. Will it be soon? Absolutely not. Can we do something about it now? We can do the things that I mentioned to you, and we can actually have actions on a daily basis that take us to that point in time. And when we do that, then we're going to be closer, and eventually at one point where it will be accepted that way. Yeah, but for now...
If you have in mind afterwards what we heard many times in DFS program, for example, about Mariana Mazzucato, when she always gets like the engine in the administration, what is afterwards developed by private companies and all that, it tends to look like this should be a human right in a way, because afterwards it happens something strange. Then they say, okay, you have to vaccinate. How do you ask for it on the internet? Or as Fabio Stable used to say also for DFS, in Brazil, they're just running some scholarship thing, and you can only book your kids through the internet. So it's kind of crazy,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exactly why I was mentioning this importance of partnerships and collaborations, right, between public and private and civil society organizations in this space. Everything really is about collaboration and smart collaborations, innovation around that as well. There will be some really good innovation between government and civil societies, others between private and government, what have you. But that collaboration is critical. And I think what you were just saying, and I'm a big fan of Mariana Mariana's work, Mariana Mazzucato's work. In fact, we're doing a lot of work with it right now. I think it's a great way of thinking about this problem. In fact, I'm hoping that you all will be looking at the report that we are about to publish, that is our annual affordability report, and we actually explore this question precisely. What if we were to think about universal access and connectivity from a mission theory perspective, and what would that do? How differently would we think about internet access? So stay tuned and look it up.
Yeah,
I cannot tell you too much yet.
Do you have anyone? No, yeah, you can go. I mean, do you have anyone in the stage wants, anyone in the auditorium who wants to make any question? I think we've got a very shy public today audience. I don't know, anyone who wants to ask from the upper part or down? I'll have to do the last one. I mean, normally it tends to, oh, great, thank you very much.
Thank you, this is terrific.
I can hold it for you.
Thank you, this is terrific. I'm curious, because you mentioned a variety of things that need to happen. What are you most optimistic about, given current trends, and what are the pieces that you think are actually going to be most challenging to reach these goals by 2030?
Yeah, that's a great question. So things that I'm most hopeful for is that I think, sadly, because of COVID, the world has realized that we need to put more, not just on infrastructure, but actually on skills. One of the ideas that I think is really powerful in our work is digital citizenship, right? To not just have people become good users of technology, but actually own their use and define how they want to use so that they can use privately, safely, etc., right? And I think the concept of digital citizenship is one that I'm very hopeful about. I mean, I live in North America, so I'm in a very privileged situation, but my children signed digital citizenship contracts in school. And when they did that, I was like, wow, the fact that they're doing that. What if we all understood our responsibility as citizens in a digital society, right? I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about not just being smart users, but also responsible users. So I'm very hopeful for that, for us to be able to, as a world, as a community, to invest in skills in content, language, and all these other things that will not only attract more people online and to the opportunity that being online will afford them, but also to the chance of doing that in a smart way, in a way that is based on this idea of being a citizen that has the rights to act, the rights to knowledge, the right to information, etc. So to me, that's really hopeful. And I think I'm actually inspired to say that by the many amazing movements, especially feminist movements on the internet and beyond around the world that are working to use this idea of a feminist internet to really bring a better world. It's a means to right now, an end that does not look very interesting, but one that we want to be able to shape. And so it's about us owning and claiming, how do we want that journey of access to the internet to look like? And do we want that journey to be one where equality and equity are the foundation, or do we want that journey to be one of inequality and exclusion, etc.? So if you choose the equality and equity journey, I think there's a huge opportunity to bring that all together. In terms of challenges, sadly, I told you, $428 billion. It's not very much. Same as we spend on soda a year. And we still don't get governments to say, we're going to put the money. Development organizations, international financial institutions, banks, everyone. It's that simple. We're still not doing it. Why? We're not doing it because many folks in the sector still believe that it's about 20, 25% margins. You know better, I mean, our world where we live, the demands of revenue and the demands on margins are very high, when it's okay to provide a public good at 10%. It's okay to provide a public good if the margins that one gets is maybe a little less. You're still making money. I'm all pro-business. I don't think that we should just eliminate that. That is not the answer, because we want businesses to thrive. They're part of an economy that is sustainable. But we can change. We can reframe the concept, right? We can think about revenues in a new perspective, that it's not just about numbers and margins and frankly, exploitation in many cases, but it becomes one about being part of a system, of a society where we can all be part of that collective in a positive way, including saying we can choose, instead of having a 20% margin or a 15% margin, that to provide services in rural areas or to the large percentages of population in the world that live with much lower incomes, it's okay if we do 5% margins or if we accept a 10% margin. That rethinking of how the world can work, I think it's really important. You are in New York. You're certainly not making money on providing services to those low-income populations that you mentioned to us in your presentation. That kind of thinking, the ability to do that, it's really important. The governments that I work with in low and middle-income countries do not have the ability. They don't have budgets that allow them to do that. That's why it's a collective effort of the international community to make sure that we support that journey so that countries will have those resources to do those things like what you're doing in your city, but you are privileged to be able to do. Most folks that I work with are not that privileged. And so their populations remain unconnected because they are completely dependent on private sector, on very small government budgets, and very little aid to help them fill the gaps. So I hope we can change that.
I think we have to do what you said. Let's shake the soda and react. Sonia, you're terrific and really inspiring. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We will, yes, please. Sonia Jorge.
Thank you.